So I'd like to introduce Dr. Kevin Mills. Kevin is a resident of the Illawarra near Kiama. He's now retired, but does a whole heap of different things that interest him, including what we're going to hear about tonight, which is the Five Islands group off the coast down at Port Kembla. Kevin was one of our stars for the conference, although many people wouldn't know. He wrote a couple of articles for people going on the various tours and conference excursions. He's a fount of knowledge. He's written books. I don't have a list of all of them, but I know he's very well regarded in the plant community down there, especially with ferns and rainforests. He's done a lot of work up on barren grounds. He did a very interesting talk at the conference in one of the chat rooms, but as Leonie said, the sound quality wasn't good enough to put up on our YouTube channel. So that's why we're videoing this talk tonight, and that'll be up on YouTube shortly. So without more ado, Kevin Mills.
So what I am going to talk about are the Five Islands, which is a nature reserve these days off Port Kembla. Most of you have been down that way. You would have seen the islands, I'm sure, offshore. So one of the things I did do was look at the any early impressions and any early illustrations, images of the Five Islands. One of the reasons was, you hear about it shortly, but the Big Island particularly, the vegetation on it was destroyed quite early on. You'll hear about that in a minute. So the question was, when we want to regrow the vegetation on it, what was there originally to try to replace it? So you'll see on the screen one of the images of the Five Islands, and there's quite a few of them. Five Islands, or at least the Illawarra area, was settled in 1815, so it was settled quite early. Wollongong is just north, so this is looking south towards the Five Islands. So before I do anything else, I've got to look at the concept of Five Islands. There's actually four islands, and it's not surprising that they keep calling them, or they call them the Five Islands. Now, just to orientate you, that's Hill 60 at Port Kembla. Can you, everybody, just move if you can't see the screen, thanks. That's Hill 60 there. That's Saddleback, that's the barren grounds, they're further south. So here's the islands here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. However, these two are attached by a very low spit that the waves go over pretty much in a very high, like a storm event. So that's why it's called the Five Islands. But there is a fifth island, but it's not vegetated, and you'll see it later. Okay. Anyway, so I went back and I got early impressions of it to give an idea of what it was like. Now, we can't tell much from this image, but some of the others later you'll see that we can pick up something on what might have been growing out there. So I should also explain the Five Islands. Early on, the Five Islands was the district. And sort of it was said, I have heard it said, that with the Five Islands district was anywhere where you could still see the Five Islands. So it's basically around what we call Illawarra these days, I guess. So these are a couple of early quotes. These are quite well-known commentators. They wrote books on their explorations in the Antipodes, Australia. You might have heard of Field and Backhouse before. If you go back into the history of New South Wales and Australia, for that matter, you'll come across them. So you can see there, he's talking about the islands. Five islands show one large and two small ones, and look picturesque seaward. So they were very obvious. the name Five Islands was coined by Bass. When I'll get to Bass, there's exploration south in 1796, I think it was, in a minute. So that's where the term sort of came, and it stuck, and it continued through. And Backhouse, once again, there are 5 islands. This time they give this district the name of the 5 islands, but just read the next little bit, by which it is familiarly known among the lower classes. So the lower classes call it the 5 islands, whereas everybody else call it Illawarra by that time. I think we pretty much know where they are. They're off Port Kembla here. I'll get to the naming of the islands in a moment, but you can see they're spread out quite widely. I'll talk about the last 6 to 15,000 years shortly in terms of why they're islands. So the name, once again, the names, I'll get to the names in a minute. So there's one big island, what's called Big Island, strangely enough. It's 17 hectares. I think it's the second largest island off the New South Wales coast. I think Montague is larger, and then comes Big Island. But even so, it's not very big. So it's actually quite small, and it's in these 2 bits, which we call number 1 and number 2, just for convenience, so we know when we're talking to someone what we're talking about. So there's been various names over time for the islands. They were officially named in 1953, and the local historical society had input to what to call them. And not surprisingly, they were called after Flinders and Bass, pretty much, who went south in that exploratory trip south of Port Jackson. So Flinders Island, and you'll get a photograph of it in a minute. That's the most northern one. Everybody locally calls it Toothbrush Island because it's got the shape of a toothbrush. I'll skip Martin Island for a minute. Big Island was often called Rabbit Island because there were rabbits out there in profusion at some time. Or Perkins Island. I'll get to the Perkins family in a moment. Bass Island is the second northern one. These are quite small islands. They got a little bit of vegetation on top, and the rest is rock where nothing grows, right? So most of it is just bare rock of these other islands. Bass Island's a bit funny. I was looking up Trove, and a lot of you might know about Trove. You can search newspapers that have been digitised all over Australia. It's a fantastic resource. So if I look up 5 islands, I get the district as well as the islands. Mostly it's the district, early reports, but you wade your way through it and you can find lots of stories about the actual islands. And one of them was about the name of Bass Island, or islet, I should say. You can read it there yourself. So there's a report of a large black pig on this island off Wollongong, and it went on for some time in the newspapers. And eventually, of course, what happened was they realised it was a seal. So it was named Pig Island for a little while, but that soon disappeared, of course, because it was definitely no pig. They thought the pig had floated out there off a ship or washed off a ship or something or other, all these stories about how it got out there. So returning to Martin Islet, it's the one behind Big Island from the mainland. And I think it hasn't got a name until then, and it hasn't got an early name because it was hidden behind Big Island. And from the shore, you sort of can't see it. So it didn't get this common name. And interestingly enough, I'm pretty sure the Aboriginal name, it doesn't have an Aboriginal name, whereas all the other islands do. I think it's for the same reason. You sort of can't see it easily from the mainland, realise it's actually an extra island out there. The 5th island is called Rocky Islet, or Midway Reef, and it's halfway between the Port Kembla sewage works and Big Island. So there is a 5th island, but it's unvegetated and wave washed. So there is actually 5 islands, thank heavens. So the Illawarra, much of the Illawarra is underlain by volcanic soils, volcanic rock. And the islands are no different. So these are Permian in age, so they're around 250 million years old plus. So they're very old volcanics. They're not like the red basalt soils up at Robertson. They're much, much younger. These are very old volcanic rocks. And it's characterised, the geology characterises the whole of the Illawarra. You've got the escarpment to the west, and below that, below those younger sediments, were these old, very old volcanic flows. That is, volcanic flows, one after the other. Quite a few of them, but very old. And then just quickly diverting to geology, in between each of those flows, they're latite flows, like a basalt, but they're chemically a bit different. In between those flows, like this, they have there's erosion off the side of the volcanoes, and it creates a sandstone between them. Right? It's called the Budjong sandstone. It used to be called a tuff, for those who are interested in geology and read up on that. There's TUFF, tuff. These days it's called a volcanic sandstone.
Is that above the coal measures or below?
Well below. Yeah, well below. But the coal measures are up along the escarpment, and they're much younger, and then below, then the volcanic stuff's underneath. And so the Sydney Basin sits on top of this stuff, these older rocks. Yep. So getting back to the islands, you can see that they're of volcanic origin. So when sea level was 100 to 120 metres higher, lower than it is now, these were ridges in the landscape, or knolls in the landscape. Presumably a bit bigger than they are now, but not that much because it's only a few thousand years. And sea level rose and created the islands. Roughly 6,000 years ago, it stopped increasing in height. So they became islands. Whereas before that, the edge of the Australian continent, above water, was about 30 kilometres offshore, at the edge of the continental shelf, which is still part of the Australian continent. It just happens to be underwater. So there is an Aboriginal, or was an Aboriginal present on the island. As you can imagine, it's not very far to canoe across to. It's quite close. I think it's 600 metres. I think it's the closest point to Big Island, and that's where the evidence is. So there are middens on the island. We know what a midden is. A shell debris from feeding on shellfish. There's a legend of the creation of the islands, and this here is a recent interpretation of that creation story about the islands. That was published in the local newspaper in 1953. You can easily find it in Trove. In brief, the wind, I think it was the wind spirit, lived on Mount Kira, and he had some daughters, and he went off out west creating wind. The daughters misbehaved, so he kicked them into the ocean, and that created the islands. There was an Aboriginal skeleton found on Big Island in 1926. That's a relevant date I'll talk about in a minute. And there's a traditional camp opposite Big Island in the early European days. And they'd still go out there fishing and whatever. And each of the islands, except Martin, has an Aboriginal name. National Parks has got a poster. If you go online, you can see the names. Yeah, the date 1926 is relevant because there was there was shell grit mining on the island from 1925. But anyway, we'll get to that. So the discoverer of the 5 islands is always Cook. Seems to have got everywhere, that bloke. So I think it was at April 1770, I think. He named, actually named probably Big Island, Martin Island, because he was offshore looking towards the mainland, called it Red Point. Now it seems as though he saw the islands and called it Red Point, but it was actually the islands. So Red Point was transferred to the mainland, and today it's called, where the sewage works are below Mount Six. It's called Red Point. Yeah. Cook says nothing about them really, but when they were going north and they got past the 5 islands and looked south, then you could see they were obviously islands. And this fellow with an interesting name, Pickersgill, was a master's mate, and he wrote up his own diary about the Endeavour and what they got up to. So the rest of this is about trying to go ashore roughly near Woonona, Bulli, somewhere in there. They tried to go ashore in a boat, and it was too rough, so they gave up. They never actually landed in Illawarra. But it says here, the bay is covered well to the southward by a long patch of red earth, which looks like islands and runs a great distance out to sea, a great way out to sea. First time the islands are mentioned, obviously. Now, I wasn't there at the time. This is a reenactment at some stage, but Bass and Flinders went south a couple of times. Now, this is the first record I can find, I'm pretty sure it has to be, of the term the 5 islands. So it was Bass. So he says, at sunset, past the 5 islands, laying off Hat Hill, which is Mount Kembla. Right. There's been a bit of an argument about whether Hat Head is Mount Kembla or Mount Kira, but out from sea, if you look back, Mount Kembla looks like the Hat, Mount Kira doesn't. So it's definitely Mount Kembla. So that's where the name came from. So getting back to our illustrations, early images and paintings and what have you. This is the earliest one I could find, 1817, by this army officer. To be honest, it doesn't really look like Big Island. You can see there's the island there. Doesn't look like Big Island much. And that really doesn't look like Hill 60. But I know that's looking south. It's written on it, look, Wollongong or something. I know that's what it is. One of the things of interest is that there's no trees on Big Island. All right. So I've always thought that there were never big trees on Big Island. Most of the islands don't have trees. Montague does. I don't think there's any other island that actually has trees on it as such. Shrubs, yes, but we'll get more to that in a minute. So that's the earliest illustration I can find of the islands. I've got a couple more. Once again, you can see Big Island shown as 2 islands, where it's really only one, but from the north, you can they're separated by, from here to that wall, it's not very far. Augustus Earle again, quite a well-known early painter. And there's Toothbrush or Flinders, and the others through to there, and that's Hill 60, one presumes. Taking great license with what it actually looks like. Once again, a really ridiculous Hill 60, looks like a pyramid. But the islands there, that's actually Big Island, but the separation is nowhere near that wide. It's only quite narrow. So obviously what I'm looking for is some indication of what might have grown there originally. That is before we came along and wrecked the joint. So I found this interesting one from this fellow called Charles Mundy, Godfrey Charles Mundy, another probably a Navy fellow or an Army fellow. 1852, so it was well after settlement. But it's the first mention I can find of plants and animals on the island. So that's the mid 1800s. So it's still pretty early. Wollongong area was settled in 1815, so there still weren't that many people around. So he talks about rabbits. They obviously killed and ate a rabbit, cooked it on the fire. So rabbits were there in 1849. He talks about dry scrub. Well, that gives us a bit of a hint about what the vegetation might look like. And of course, he says, ended with a grand conflagration. Their campfire got away. And it looks like the whole island was burnt. So that's also the first evidence of destroying something on the island. Although, as I said there, rabbits and goats were on the island at that time. But they often dumped them on islands for marooned seamen. So if the sailors, shipwreck or whatever, ended up on an island, they did it all around the world, destroying ecosystems everywhere. But they always introduced rabbits and particularly goats, so that there was always food there. Not to mention all the fish they could have caught. But anyway, they had to put these introduced mammals on islands, and they did it everywhere. And it's devastated so many islands. So he talks about just temporarily destroyed all vegetation on the island. So it must have pretty much burnt the island because of their campfire. And seen burning for days afterwards. So as they continued on down the coast or wherever they sailed to, that obviously kept looking at it and it kept burning. The thing is with the island, I should have explained this before, the underlying rock is the volcanic rock you saw before. On top of that are sand dunes, just like on the coast anywhere, just sand dunes. So that as the sea level rose, it pushes sand dunes in front of it, like this. All right, as you can imagine, as it does now, the sand moves around the coast, creates sand dunes and beaches, and storms wash it away and bring it back again. But the sand dunes were blowing up on the islands. Sea level stabilised, and left the sand dunes on top of the rock. So when you're walking around on the island, it's actually all sand dunes. So over time, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but over time that vegetation gets destroyed, sand dunes become unstable and move around. It's not stabilised anymore. So that first fire was probably one of the main things that happened to the island, just to what it looks like today. So the next theme is exploitation. As I've said before, the first land grants were given just nearby in Red Point in 1815, just north between Lake Illawarra and Red Point, Port Kembla. I've already said the first report of rabbits and goats on the island was 1849. The cattle were there by 1861. They used to swim them out from the shore, apparently. Now, the Perkins family were there for a relatively short while, 1867 to 72. They caught sharks for a living. Once again, if you look up the newspapers, you'll find them displaying giant sharks in the main street of Wollongong. So they caught sharks for their living. But they had goats and cattle and rabbits and so on out on the big island. And they had a dwelling there for, about 5 years. So by that time, the island had been really impacted by the activities of the people and the mammals that they'd introduced. And getting back to our 1926 skeleton, in 1925 a mining lease was gazetted on the western part of Big Island. I've got a map in a minute to show you. But look at this one here. This is 1861, so before Perkins were there. Persons are hereby cautioned against putting cattle on the island nearest the mainland, and all persons having cattle now running on the island are required to remove them within 14 days. So it was obviously Crown land and no one actually owned the island. So a few years before Perkins were there, they already had cattle out there. Why you would bother, I don't know. It's only less than 17 hectares because a lot of it's the rock around it. It's not a very big pasture. With all this land on the mainland, you wonder why would they take their cattle out there? Anyway, but the next bit, anyone found destroying the rabbits on the island would be prosecuted. So they were seen as a valuable resource to have there, whereas we think, oh no, why did they introduce them? So that's some of the stuff that went on in the 1800s on Big Island. The others, as I said, are very small. So a little bit of vegetation, they were just left alone basically, really. So this is the mining lease, just to show you what it was like. So this is 1925. It went on for a few years, but not that long. And it was a mining lease for shell grit to get the lime to make cement. So they worked in this. There's Rocky Island. Remember the little island in the middle? There's one part of Big Island, the other part's out here. There's the survey just to locate the mining lease, which is in here. This just there is in the middle of the western part of Big Island. It's Perkins Beach. That's the official name for the beach from 1953. And that's where you land. You jump off the front of the Zodiac, and landing on the islands isn't that hard. Isn't that easy? Sorry, isn't that easy? It's pretty hard. It's all rock. The sea's a bit too rough. It's too dangerous to jump off the front of the Zodiac. But there's a little sandy beach, particularly at low tide. There's a bit of sand. You can land there. Anyway, so that was a mining lease. So for some years they mined shell grit there and took it off to Port Kembla and unloaded it. And there's a few stories once again the newspapers. You can see the stories about getting shell grit there and about Italian immigrants drowning and the ship sinking and all sorts of stuff went on. I went looking. These are survey marks, and I went looking for them, and I actually found one. There's this little peg here. It's a little brass thing about that high on the rock. It's from 1925, so it's still there. Now the final theme is conservation, which I'm heading about, the sort of stuff we've been doing in the last 5 or 6 years. So prior to 1960, it was just vacant Crown land, and it was a free-for-all. Mainly fishermen would go out there and camp and fish and do whatever they liked. You might know about the Fauna Protection Act. The 1948 is the date it came in, but it was 1960 when the 5 islands were declared a nature fauna reserve. At that time they were called under that act, and the government set up a local committee or panel to manage it. Under the fauna protection panel was up here, and they had various committees managing all very small reserves around New South Wales in those days. None of them were very big. And it was set up for seabirds mainly, because there were seabirds breeding, which we'll get to a bit later. So that was 1960. So it was managed by a local committee of citizens, and they got a bit of money to do various things, not much, no doubt, in those days. They wouldn't have got much resources to do anything. One of the things they did do was initiate studying seabirds. And that's gone on since that time. Different people have taken it over the years, but the study of seabirds has gone on for a very long time out there. There's a lot of records about the seabirds and whether they're increasing or decreasing and so on. So with human habitation comes rubbish tips. And with rubbish tips near the coast come seagulls. And the seagull population out there exploded. I think it was 40,000 pairs at one time, I read somewhere, and probably more. So there was concerns about the number of seagulls, which they thought was causing erosion, among other things, being a nuisance at the tip and around town, pinching your chips and all sorts of things that seagulls tend to do. And I'll once again come back to that theme in a moment. So there was concern about the gulls. This is the committee, management committee, and there was concern about erosion. Remember what I said about the sand dunes? So the vegetation is stripped off, which has developed over a very long time, stabilising the sand dunes. Once the sand dunes are mobilised, it's very hard for the vegetation to then recolonise bare sand. And so there was erosion happening at that time. So the National Parks and Wildlife Act of 1967, it became a nature reserve rather than a fauna reserve under the other act, the other act was discarded. So national parks have been managing it ever since then. More recently, the concern has been weeds and lack of native vegetation. I'll get to the story of kikuyu grass in a moment. So this is an aerial view of 1960 shot. You can see there's not many houses out on the red point at that stage. There's sewage works tucked in here. So that's Rocky Islet, the little islet in the middle that makes up number 5, and of course that's Big Island and that's Martin Island. So see how it looks like 2 islands. It's really only one. It's hard to get an appreciation of what's happening on a Big Island at that time, but if you look closer, you can see the sand dunes, the white areas on Big Island. So the sand dunes were mobile; they weren't stable. And there's photographs from 1938, I think it was, from a paper on the vegetation out there, and there's photographs in there that show bare sand dunes. So that's what the situation was about 1960. After 100 years of basically abuse and no care about the island. And this is pretty much what it's like now. This is Hill 60, of course. There's the sewage works once again. That's Rocky Island, and there's the 2 islands, Martin and Big Island. I'm concentrating on Big Island from here on because that's the biggest island. It's where we've done all our work. It's where the most impact has happened. The other small islands have got tiny bits of vegetation on top. Good for seabird breeding, and there's a bit of vegetation, but in terms of visits by people and impact, it's quite low. This is where all the action is here. So I don't need to, I think I've said a lot of that already. The highest elevation is 16 metres on Big Island, so it's not very high. That's the top of the highest sand dune sitting over the rock. Minimum distance, there it is, 450 metres, so it's not very far out. People readily kayak around the islands. It's no issue. It is a nature reserve, but you can't land without a permit, mainly because of seabird breeding. There are burrows everywhere. You can't walk anywhere without stomping on burrows. And at certain times of the year, they've obviously got eggs and chicks in it, and we don't want to destroy them. But there's a volunteer program called Friends of 5 Islands, and people have been taken out to weed and whatever. And other people are growing plants to take out to the island. There's quite a community input there, and it's pretty popular. The program is pretty well known in the Wollongong area. COVID has mucked things up, of course. So lately, I went out in April, I think it was, earlier this year, but things have slowed down a lot. We've lost a lot of ground, unfortunately. But I'm hoping to ramp that up next year. So the total area of the islands is roughly 26 hectares, so you can see it. And that includes the rock around the edges of each island. So it's not much land at all, but quite important for seabirds. And we're hoping it'll be important for native vegetation in the future. We've got examples from the islands to the south of what probably grew there, so we've got a pretty good idea of what was there. The earliest study of the vegetation in any detail was 1924, when Rodway went out. Rodway was a botanist doctor from Nowra. You come across him regularly if you look at local plants. And then 1938 was a major paper on vegetation. That's really the baseline at the time. There's not much before that. So there we have Big Island. You can see the two parts, which we call number 1, number 2. So that's 2008. So that was 10 years really before we started doing the work we're doing. A couple of things to note, perhaps, while I've got it up. You can see the green, this green particularly, that's all kikuyu grass. It's about that deep, very energy sapping to walk through. It's like walking on a giant sponge. It's not much fun, to be honest. It's taken over all that part of the island, and to some extent up here, but not as much because the soils are very shallow. It's quite rocky at that end. Kikuyu, as you know, was introduced to Australia about the 1920s, I think. It became a favourite of pastures. So Jamboree Valley is just all kikuyu grass pastures. And that took over from buffalo grass, which was used before then, and other grasses. But kikuyu grass from Kenya is just so vigorous. And as you know what it's like in big long runners and very vigorous grass. So that fauna protection panel, before they were disbanded in 1967, they were very concerned about the bare sand dunes, and they talked about introducing kikuyu grass. So they went to the CSIRO and said, what do you think about this? And the CSIRO came back and said, don't bother, it won't grow because of the salt. They didn't think it would survive. I have pretty reliable evidence, and I know a certain person planted kikuyu grass there about 1968, worried about the sand dunes. Because I've got a map that was made at the time and it shows little tiny bits of kikuyu grass in about 5 places on the island. That didn't naturally happen all of a sudden, so yeah, it was planted, unfortunately. So now it's a major management problem. Firstly, this destroys everything. It grows over everything, as you know what kikuyu is like. If you've got a kikuyu lawn, or look at the paddocks around the place. The other issue is those long runners, those long rhizomes of the grass. The shearwaters and penguins get caught around their legs and they starve to death because they can't escape. And I've seen it a couple of times, of birds caught up in the long kikuyu runners. So there's the shearwaters and the penguins, for that matter, can't burrow through a metre of kikuyu grass. They can't get to the soil. So that's the other issue. The area that they can breed on the island is reduced considerably. So I just got a couple of shots of the other islands just to show you what they're like. So you can see this is Bass Island here. So it's mainly rock with a tiny little bit of edge on top. But there are seabirds breeding around the higher part for sure. And Martin Island, it's much the same. There's just this little bit of vegetation here. I was telling someone earlier that these days there's a seal colony taking up residence on Martin Island. Probably come up from Montague Island because they're expanding their population these days, seals. I counted about 200 on Martin Island at one point a couple of years ago. This is Toothbrush or Flinders Island. You can see the shape, but from the mainland it looks like a toothbrush, as you can imagine. This is a little plateau with vegetation on it, and this is all lower at this end. Getting back to Bass Island, I was giving this talk at one stage, and someone piped up and said, "Oh, I know about Toothbrush Island. You know, Bass Island's called Toothpaste Island, don't you?" Because it's the closest one to the Toothbrush Island. I mentioned bird breeding a couple of times. There's quite a few species breed out there, seabirds, as well as the seagulls. You've got penguins, a healthy penguin population out there. Pelicans, I think it's the only island nesting site in New South Wales for pelicans. They're usually an inland breeder, but for some years they've been breeding out there. You can see the young ones there. These are the burrows that the shearwaters make. This area with the dead grass, that's one of our sprayed areas. We sprayed the kikuyu, helicopter spraying on areas, and you'll see that in a moment. One of the other birds that took up breeding out here with a white ibis. These are white ibis nests. And they're out there in the shrubs. The shrub is the New Zealand Coprosma repens. Coastal coprosma, I'm not sure. Almira plant, I think we call it. Yeah, so there are shrubs out there, which you saw a bit on that photograph before, but it's an introduced shrub. The number of introduced species on the island far outweigh the natives. A lot of those come and go. Like every time I go, I get a new weed, but it's transitory. It doesn't really last that long. One of the funny things out there are vegetables, because the seagulls go to the rubbish tip at White's Gully south of Wollongong and take food back. I've brought pumpkins back from there in the past, nice big Queensland blue pumpkins, sunflowers, capsicums, melons of all sorts, you name it. It's because the seagulls keep taking out the bits that are left and the seeds go with it. So, yeah. So this is just the papers. There was 2 papers written. I said, what year did I do? 1938, I think I said. But there was a botanical study done in 1938 when the dunes were quite bare. As I said, the photographs, you can see it's quite bare. So that was very useful because kikuyu and other weeds weren't that abundant, even though it was very disturbed. That weeds hadn't sort of taken over. There were few weeds at that time. It was only later, particularly kikuyu, and I'll talk about another weed in a minute. So that's what it looked like in 1938. You can see the dunes are quite bare in places. So you think now what that's like. It's kikuyu about that deep, all up over the whole thing. Dramatic difference. So there was a vegetation map in that paper, and this is pretty much my version of it. You can see there, but basically it's pretty much native vegetation and bare sand at that time. In 61 things change quite a lot. This is buffalo grass, this one. So this is before kikuyu got really going. It's just not there. These couple of maps were done by the Scoutmaster David Walsh from Mount Kira Scout Camp, a well-known local conservationist, and he went out there regularly with Doug Gibson and others to study the seabirds and other things. And luckily, when he went out from time to time, he did a map of what he found on the ground. So I've got a series of maps of what happened to the vegetation in that period. So buffalo grass looks like it was the main introduced grass out there at that time, and indeed there was a report in the newspaper about picnicking on Big Island, and people would go out and picnic there, and I'm pretty sure that's where they mentioned a lawn of buffalo grass. Right. So one of the things I could do with these maps and the 1938 map, I could map the demise of Coria alba. You know Coria alba, the coastal coria, the white one? Yep. You can see here, that's 1938. This one was probably one of the main shrubs, as perhaps you'd expect at that time. And the series of maps shows by the time, this is 89 there. This is my map from 89 when I first started going there. There's one little dot right on the end. And it just disappeared. This story of all the native plants, that was just one I could do because Dave Walsh had mapped the coria distribution. So here's the increase in the kikuyu grass. So I'll put 62 on this when we know it wasn't there. By 69, it's in these little spots. And it's pretty unlikely that that happened naturally all of a sudden, turning up in so many spots. And then I subsequently found out that someone at the time told me who planted it. So with good intentions, but it was really the wrong thing to do, as hindsight tells us. And you can see here, now it's all over the island, particularly here. So I mentioned about the cover, the natives, but this is the cover I've tried to, with it using the maps to try to determine the cover percentage. So, for instance, this is kikuyu here, up to 19, I got there, 1990, I think there. That's kikuyu, and the decrease in the other species to almost nothing. So the management challenge is what to do about kikuyu. If we want to bring seabirds back and make them more abundant, give them more space to breed and so on, and stop killing them with kikuyu. This is what we're faced with. As I keep saying, it's just a deep, dense map of kikuyu runners going everywhere and nothing else. The only place that there are other species, and this is weeds and natives, and there are some remnant natives around, but they're all around the very edge. Firstly, because the soils are thinner and on rock, and it's harder for the kikuyu to dominate. Secondly, I think because it's the salt influence on the kikuyu knocks it back right on the edge of the island. So this is basically the middle, towards the middle of that number one island, or the western part of Big Island. So this is one of the seabird blokes hand down a shearwater burrow, checking out what's there. You can imagine how hard it is for the shearwaters to burrow through this deep mass. But this isn't kikuyu. In recent years, Coast Morning Glory is taking over the kikuyu. I didn't think anything could take over kikuyu, but it is. So this whole area, which is the northwest corner of number one island, is dominated by Coast Morning Glory. You can see some shrubs in the background. They're all the New Zealand coprosma. So we take a look at the number of plant species over the time since I've got records. And the red line is the introduced plants, the blue line are natives. It's not a surprising story, really. But there's a bit of a kick up here in the natives. Number one, we started planting. Number two, once we got rid of the kikuyu, and you'll see a photo in a minute, the natives came back themselves. off the top of my head, I can think of 3 coastal species that just turned up because we got rid of the kikuyu. And one of them is actually quite a rare, it's not threatened or anything, but it's quite a rare local species. So how to attack an island covered in kikuyu? So the island was a part of the western, or number 1 island, was divided up into sections. So we started here. So we did helicopter spraying with a cone spray. So it's a cone like that. The helicopter flies low over it, GPS tracking, it knows exactly where it is, and it can spray accurately inside that area. And that's been done to all of these areas. So some months after the spraying, the kikuyu dies, goes to dust, terrible stuff, goes to like dust, and it just goes to the ground like that. It's no longer that high, it's like that high, just collapses down like that. So we worked our way around the island like this and sprayed it and followed up with planting, particularly in these couple. The first couple we did was pretty densely planted at the time. These less so because COVID came along and it's really just stopped us doing what we wanted to do. These stars are monitoring plots, 20 by 20 metres, and they're monitored every time I go out, or at least once a year, to see what's growing in those plots as a sample of what's happening. So this is just before we sprayed number 1 area, which is up in this corner. What they did was they marked the boundary of it physically like that, so the helicopter bloke could see more easily where to go. But you take it from me, he sprayed inside that area. Yeah, it's pretty good. The other thing to notice off this photograph, you see there's a line through there, like that, with different texture of the vegetation. This is the morning glory, and that's the kikuyu. That morning glory wasn't there when I started going there as a uni student in the 1980s. It wasn't there. Not that long ago, it sort of took off for some reason. And now it's all over this part of the island. Now it's susceptible to spraying. It does kill it, but it comes back pretty well. That's a kikuyu. It comes back pretty well because the rhizomes go through, and stems under the ground perhaps aren't affected by the herbicide, and so on. So you've got to keep at it, or you've really lost the plot. Yeah.
What did you spray with?
I can't give you. I can find out, but I don't know. It'll be a safe herbicide that they approve. Yeah, that's not my area really. If you look from the mainland, that's the huts there that take mainly the bird researchers, because they need to be there at night. But I've stayed out there a couple of times. But mainly I go out for the day and come back. They're actually shipping containers. Not the most comfortable, but they were put there a long time ago. There's the shrubs again. They're all mirror plant, the New Zealand species, so they're not native. So this is plot number 1 actually, I believe, in area 1. So that's my tape. It goes 20 metres by 20 metres, and that's the samples, the standard sample size for New South Wales these days. So whatever's growing in this square gets recorded, and an abundance or cover rating is written down for it. And you can see dramatic changes over time, because this is before we spray. Right? And there's the same plot after planting, and the spraying's happened. Kikuyu's died back. The planting has come in. They planted up with things like lamandra, some shrubs like myoporum, Banksia integrifolia, things like that, which we're pretty confident would have occurred there as shrubs, not as big trees. That's what it looked like. Well, there's 2018. What was the last date? 2014. So that's 4 years later after the spraying, waiting for it to die down enough, then planting, and that's a few years after that. So remember, there's the huts for reference. So this is area 1, goes north from the huts. And that's what happens. There's that line in the grass. So that's what happens a bit some weeks after you spray it, or months probably. This kikuyu dies right down, and it just disintegrates in your hand. So, as I said, it's like dust, very fine dust. One interesting thing as an aside, you can see the seagulls. They're not nesting in the sprayed area. And it's because even though they're colonial nesting species, every nest wants a little bit of cover from the next nest. So they can be right next to each other, but you'll find there's a bit of grass, but so they can't see each other directly like this. So, of course, with the kikuyu, it's all the same height. There's nothing, so they don't nest in it. But the shearwaters certainly do, because they can now burrow into the soil. And that's, what was that? That's 2014. So that's 6 months or so later. So a lot of this is planted lamandra. You probably all know lamandra, the coastal, common one rather. See it everywhere. Commonly planted in council parks and whatever. There's good weed suppressant and no maintenance and that sort of thing. But amongst that, there's a lot of New Zealand spinach, commelina. There's a lot of that, native plants. Those two native plants became very common in the area that was treated. Whereas before, this area was dense kikuyu. But it took a lot of effort to get to this point. The main couple of weeds have to be dug out, basically pulled out every time you saw one for some time to get to this point. That was 15, so now we're going to 18. Bit much the same. So any major weed that pops up in this area was weeded out. So you get seedlings of the coprosma. And kikuyu coming back, the Coast Morning Glory was creeping in from the side and coming into it. You had to keep on top of these things to arrive at this, which is pretty much all native. This is another plot. So there's the hut again. So this is south of the hut. There's the zodiac there. So this is where you land. So you sort of jump off the side of the zodiac into the water, and we haul the boat up and so on. So it's sort of protected a bit because it's on the western side, tucked in that side of the island, but it can be quite rough. So that's 2016. So that's after spraying and the initial planting's taken place. You can see bits of lamandra there. And there it is. So once again, that's 2 years, less than 2 years later. Lamandra is growing very, very well. It's really a good species to use. And if you go to Tollgate Islands, for example, the whole top of one of the parts of the Tollgate Islands is lamandra. So it's quite natural that it does this. The bird people like it because the birds can go underneath it. They aren't restrained from digging burrows or moving around. So it's a pretty good plant to use. And it's relatively fast growing, it seems. As you can imagine out there, the soils are very nutrient rich with so many seagulls breeding out there and bringing all sorts of stuff to the island. So particularly chicken bones. There are chicken bones everywhere. It's coming from the tip. So on that very southern point of the number one island, there is a nice small stand of native vegetation that's managed to survive right on the edge of the edge of the island where the kikuyu hasn't quite been able to dominate. So the few familiar plants, the pig face, the Carpobrodus, the Spirobolus, the coastal, whatever that common name is for it, and a few other species. So there's still a bit of hope there. I think that's it. Okay.
If you enjoyed this video, why not subscribe and view other great content? New videos being added all the time.